Good morning, students. So, welcome you all to another session. So, let's begin today's session. So, in the previous class, we have completed with the respiration in case of frog, right? So, we have completed with two parts in the anatomy of frog. One is the topic called as digestive system, and the second one is respiration, right? So, today, let's take up with the next system what we have. And the next system what we'll be taking up is the circulatory system in case of frog, right? So, let's begin today's session by taking up with the circulatory system in frog. Okay, so talking about the circulatory system. So the circulatory system in case of frog is said to be a very well developed circulatory system, right? So the type of circulatory system here is said to be a closed type of circulatory system, and we are all very much familiar with what we actually mean by a closed type of circulatory system, right? So a closed type of circulatory system shows that they are provided with something called as the blood vessels, and the blood actually flows only in the blood vessels, right? And it does not come out of the blood vessels. So if that is the case, we would start calling it as a closed type of circulatory system. And these organisms also show this closed type of circulatory system, right? Now, talking about the circulatory system in these organisms, there are three major components of the circulatory system in these organisms, right? So the first major component of the circulatory system is the heart. Right? The heart is one of the major components of the circulatory system in these organisms. The second one is the blood vessels. And the third component of the circulatory system is the blood. Right? So these are the three major components of the blood vessels, of the circulatory system in these organisms. So they have a heart, a very well developed heart. They have blood vessels, well developed blood vessels. That's the reason why we start calling it as a closed type of circulatory system. And the blood, which is the major component of the circulatory system. Right? Now let us take up with each one in little detail. So let us first begin with the heart in case of the frog. Now talking about heart in case of frog, the heart of frog is said to be a myogenic heart. Right? So we are all familiar with what we mean by a myogenic heart. So the heart here in case of frog is said to be a myogenic heart. Now what does this myogenic heart actually refer to? So myogenic heart is nothing but the signals that are required for the contraction of the heart muscles or the contraction of the heart originates from the heart muscles itself. If that is the case, we would actually start calling it as a myogenic heart. So the heart in case of frog is actually considered to be a myogenic heart. Now, talking about the chambers of the heart. The chambers of the heart present in frog, it is said to be a three-chambered heart. Right? So frogs have a three-chambered heart. Now, when we say it is a three-chambered heart, what does that mean? They have two auricles. Right, there are two auricles and there is one ventricle, right, giving a total of a three-chambered heart. Right, so two auricles and one ventricle is actually a part of the heart in these organisms. So a three-chambered heart. So in case of fishes, if you see, it is a two-chambered heart with only one auricle and one ventricle. Then we have a three-chambered heart, which is seen in case of amphibians, which is nothing but the frog. And then in later organisms, that is the aves and mammals, it is said to be a completely divided four-chambered heart. Now let us take up with these three-chambered heart and let us see how the chambers of the heart are arranged and what is the things that actually happen to this particular heart. Right? So let us take up with the structure of the heart in case of frog. Now, as we know that there are two auricles that are present in the heart of these organisms, right? So when we start drawing the diagram, so the diagram what we are doing is slightly different than the normal one because we need to understand a few things, right? So here, this would be one auricle, right? And here would be the other auricle. Right, so these are the two auricles what is present in the frog heart, right? So this auricle would be the right auricle. Right, so this one would be the right. I hope all of you are familiar with the orientation of the human system as well as the organisms factor also. So this would be the left auricle. Now, first let's talk about the right auricle, then we'll come back to the left auricle. We know that the right side of the heart always has deoxygenated blood. So here also the right auricle, so we are all very much familiar with this, right? Auricles, we start calling auricles as the receivers of the blood. Right? So auricles are usually regarded as the receivers of the blood, while the ventricles are usually called as the distributors of the blood. So auricles always receive the blood, either it be oxygenated blood or the deoxygenated blood, while the ventricles are always considered to be the distributors of the blood. So ventricles are the ones which start distributing the blood either to the respiratory organs or to different parts of the body through something called as the systemic aorta or the systemic arch. Right. Now, since we are talking about auricles, auricles are nothing but the receivers of the blood. So we know that the right auricle is the one which is responsible for receiving the deoxygenated blood, because we know that the right side of the heart always has the deoxygenated blood. So I hope all of you are familiar with what we mean by deoxygenated blood, right? So blood which is rich in carbon dioxide, we would start calling it as deoxygenated blood. Right. So the right auricle would receive deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body. Now, before the blood actually enters into the right auricle, the blood actually enters into one more small chamber, what we actually call it as the accessory chamber. So here we would have another small chamber being present, which we would start calling it as the accessory chamber. Right. So this would be the accessory chamber that is being present. Right. So this accessory chamber, we would start calling it as the sinus venosus. Right. So sinus venosus is this accessory chamber that is being present. Now this sinus venosus, which is the accessory chamber, this accessory chamber is said to be a highly developed structure in case of fishes. While in case of amphibians, such as frogs, the structure is said to be slightly reduced structure. While in case of other organisms such as aves and mammals, it becomes highly reduced and it would actually become a part of the right auricle. Right. So this is the one, if you remember, when we were talking about the human heart, we spoke about something called as the sinoatrial node, SA node. We started calling it as the pacemaker. Right. So this structure, that is the sinus venosus, is the one which would get transformed into the nodal tissue called the SA node, and it would get embedded in this particular right auricle. Right. So in case of humans and aves, that is birds, it is said to be a highly reduced structure, and it would actually become a part of the right auricle. While in case of fishes, it is a highly developed structure. In case of amphibians and reptiles, a bit reduced structure, and this is how it actually appears. Now, the deoxygenated blood from different parts of the body will start entering into this sinus venosus, right? It would enter into the sinus venosus, and from the sinus venosus, it would now enter into this right auricle. So right auricle now consists of this deoxygenated blood. Right. So this is the deoxygenated blood part, or the right auricle part. Talking about the left auricle now. We know that left auricle is the one which is responsible for receiving the oxygenated blood. Right. So the oxygenated blood is being received into the left auricle through the blood vessels, right, which would originate from the lungs as well as the skin, right? Because yesterday we were talking about the process of respiration, right? So we said that these organisms respire either through the skin, right, cutaneous respiration, or they would respire either with the help of lungs, what we also call it as the pulmonary respiration, right? So since the process of oxygenation takes place in both skin when the animal is in water, as well as the lungs when the animal is on land, so oxygenated blood from either the skin or the lungs will start entering into this particular left auricle. So here there are two blood vessels which would actually bring those oxygenated blood into the thing here. Right, so these are the two blood vessels which are actually present. So let me just cut this out. Right, so these blood vessels will start bringing oxygenated blood. Now, oxygenated blood will actually be present here. Right, so this would be the oxygenated blood, and this would be the deoxygenated blood. Now, deoxygenated blood is now present in the right auricle. Oxygenated blood is now present in the left auricle. Now, oxygenated blood from the deoxygenated blood will now be passed on into the ventricles. So here, the number of ventricles is said to be only one, right? So let me just do that ventricle part also. So here you would have the ventricle, right? So this is the ventricle. A single ventricle is being present. Right, there is a single ventricle being present. So the deoxygenated blood now from the right auricle will now enter into the ventricle, and at the same time oxygenated blood from the left auricle will now start entering into the ventricle. So what exactly is happening in the ventricle? So let me just show that also. So this would be the oxygenated blood. What I have actually shown here in red, because we know oxygenated blood is said to be reddish in color, bright reddish in color, while the deoxygenated blood is said to be somewhat purplish in color. So, so there is in the ventricle, since there is only one ventricle being present, there is mixing of the oxygenated as well as the deoxygenated blood happening. Now this mixed blood will now be passed on to two different parts of the body. So how exactly it is being passed is, there is one more larger vessel which actually arises from here, right? So there is one large vessel which actually arises from here, right? And this large vessel, we will start giving it a name which is called as a truncus arteriosus. Truncus arteriosus. Now, this is also considered to be an additional chamber, accessory chamber, which is seen in case of amphibians. Right? Again, this truncus arteriosus is said to be a highly developed structure in case of fishes, while in case of amphibians, it becomes a slightly reduced structure. Whereas in case of aves and mammals, again, it will be completely reduced and we will not be able to observe this truncus arteriosus at all. Right? Now, this truncus arteriosus from the inner side, there would be a partition here from the inner side, which would divide the truncus arteriosus into two larger vessels, right? So one vessel would actually go here, this way, and the other vessel would actually come out like this, right? So what exactly is happening? One vessel will start taking the blood. So this will, let us assume that this vessel. So this vessel will now start taking the blood either to the lungs or the skin for the process of oxygenation, right? So one side, this particular one vessel, one of the branches of the truncus arteriosus, will now start taking the mixed blood to either the lungs or the skin for the process of oxygenation. Right. Whereas the other branch of the truncus arteriosus, we would start calling it as the systemic aorta or the systemic arch, right? Aorta or the systemic arch, which would carry the blood into the systemic circulation, where it would pass on the blood to different parts of the body. Yeah. So this is what exactly is happening in case of these organisms with the two auricles as well as one ventricle that is actually being present. Right. So the mixed blood is the one, right? The mixed blood is the one which is actually passed on to the different parts of the body, and at the same time, the mixed blood is actually the one which is actually sent for the process of oxygenation, either to the lungs or to the skin. Right? So this is what we have with the heart in case of these organisms called the frog, which is said to be a three-chambered heart with two auricles and one ventricle. Now, since there is no complete separation of the ventricle, what exactly is happening here? There is mixing of the blood happening, as a result of which the mixed blood is being sent to different parts of the body. Okay, so this is what we have with the structure of the heart in case of the frog, a three-chambered heart, a myogenic heart in case of the frogs. Now, there is one name given for the heart in case of frog, right? So the heart here in case of frog is actually called as the atriovenous heart. Atriovenous heart. So the heart here in case of these organisms is referred to as the atriovenous heart. Now what does this mean? The atriovenous heart. If you remember when we were talking about the fishes, right? We said that in fishes, the type of blood that is being sent to different parts of the body, it is systemic circulation. We said that it is the deoxygenated blood. So if deoxygenated blood is being pumped to different parts of the body, such type of heart we actually started calling it as the venous heart. The venous heart. So venous heart is the one which would send or which would pump the deoxygenated blood to different parts of the body. In case of humans, if you see, the human heart is called as the atrial heart. That is the atrial heart. So atrial heart refers to the heart which would pump oxygenated blood to different parts of the body. Right? So if a heart pumps out oxygenated blood to different parts of the body, we would start calling it as the atrial heart. If the heart pumps deoxygenated blood to different parts of the body, we would start calling it as the venous heart. But here, the blood that is being pumped to different parts of the body is called a mixed blood. That's the reason why we start calling the heart here as the atriovenous heart. Okay? So the type of heart here, it is called as the atriovenous heart. The second thing here, the type of circulation here in these organisms. The type of circulation here is usually referred to as the double circulation. Right? The type of circulation here is usually referred to as the double circulation. Now, what does this mean, double circulation? We know that in double circulation, what we actually refer to double circulation is the blood enters into the heart twice before it is passed on to different parts of the body. Right? So before the blood is sent to different parts of the body, if the blood enters into the heart twice, we would start calling it as a double circulation. Let me just give you a clear explanation about this. Right? Say suppose the blood is to go to the stomach. So from the heart it has to go to the stomach. So what exactly is happening? From the stomach, we know that after the process of deoxygenation in the stomach, whatever oxygen is present in the blood will now go into the stomach. As a result of which, whatever carbon dioxide is there in the stomach will now pass on into the blood. So that is the exchange of gases, all that is happening. Now this deoxygenated blood from the stomach, directly it would enter into the right auricle. So first time the blood is actually entering into the heart. So it would enter into the right auricle. So from the right auricle, it would go into the ventricles. From the ventricles, again, it would go into this lungs or the skin for the process of oxygenation. After oxygenation, the oxygenated blood will now start entering into the left auricle. So second time, the blood is actually entering into the heart. So once the blood enters into the left auricle, from here it would enter into the ventricle. From the ventricle, again, it would be passed on into the systemic circulation, and then it would reach the stomach. So before the blood reaches any organ in the body, right? If the blood enters into the heart twice, we would start calling it as a double circulation. So double circulation actually begins from the amphibians, not a complete double circulation. We actually give it a term. We would start calling it as the incomplete double circulation. Right? The reason why we use the term called incomplete double circulation is because it is the mixed blood which is actually being transported to different parts of the body, or the mixed blood which is being sent to different parts of the body. If this is the case, we would actually start calling it as the incomplete double circulation. So these two things you need to remember whenever we talk about the heart in case of the frogs. Right? One is the type of heart here is said to be called as the atriovenous heart, and number two, the type of circulation here is said to be an incomplete double circulation. Okay, so this is what we have in the first part of the circulatory system, which is the heart in case of this organism called as the frog. Right. Next one, talking about the blood vessels. Now, these organisms, as I've already mentioned, they have a closed type of circulatory system. Now, since they have a closed type of circulatory system, blood is restricted or it is limited to flow only in the blood vessels. So blood will not come out of the blood vessels. If at all the blood comes out of the blood vessel, what would happen? There would be clotting of blood. Right. Now, there are three different types of blood vessels present in these organs. Very much similar, excuse me, very much similar to that of the human blood vessel. The first blood vessel, we start calling as the artery. Right. So we know what exactly is the role of an artery. So artery is the larger blood vessel which is actually responsible for carrying the blood away from the heart. So the blood from the heart is carried to different parts of the body through this blood vessel, larger blood vessel, which is called as the artery. The second blood vessel that is present is called the veins. Right? So there is this veins also. So veins are the blood vessels which are responsible for bringing the blood back to the heart. Right? So the blood vessels which brings the blood back to the heart is nothing but this veins. The third blood vessels are nothing but the capillaries. Right? The capillaries. So this is the third type of blood vessels. So capillaries are nothing but smaller branches of the arteries and veins, right? Smaller branches which arise from the arteries and veins, which are responsible for innervating into the tissues. So we know that arteries and veins have a larger diameter. So because of their larger diameter, they will not be able to penetrate into the tissues, or they will not be able to innervate into the tissues. So for that reason, the arteries and the veins undergo intensive branching, as a result of which those branched structures will now be able to innervate into the tissues, as a result of which any exchange of substances between the blood and the tissues usually happens through these smaller blood vessels, which are called as the arteries. Right? So these are the three different blood vessels which are present in these organisms: the arteries, the veins, as well as the capillaries. Right. Next, talking about the next structure here, the blood. Now, talking about the blood here in these organisms again has two components. One is the plasma, very much similar to that of humans. So they also have this plasma, which is nothing but the fluid or the liquid part of the blood, the plasma is being present. And along with plasma, they also have something called as the form elements. Right? The form elements are also being present. Form elements is nothing but the cellular component of the blood. Right? So the blood consists of both plasma, the liquid part of the blood, as well as the cells also. Now talking about the cells in case of the blood, right? There are three different types of cells present. The first one, there is something called as the RBCs, which is called the red blood corpuscles. Second one, they have this WBCs, and the third one, they would have the platelets. Right, so RBCs, WBCs, platelets. So all three different types of cells are actually being present in these organisms, right? So they have the red blood cells, white blood cells, as well as the platelets. Now, one characteristic feature here with regards to the blood cells of frogs compared to that of humans is, in case of frogs, the RBC is said to be nucleated. Because in case of humans, we know that the mature RBC is said to be enucleated. Right? So to accommodate more of hemoglobin, the mature RBC is said to be enucleated in case of humans. But in these organisms, the RBC is said to be nucleated. Number two, the second characteristic feature here is the platelets are also said to be nucleated in these organisms. While in case of humans, we know that the platelets are said to be enucleated. The reason why platelets are enucleated in case of humans is because we know that in case of humans, the platelets are actually being formed as a result of fragmentation of the larger cells which are present in the red bone marrow, and those larger cells we start calling them as the megakaryocytes. Right? So due to the fragmentation of megakaryocytes which are present in the red bone marrow, the platelets in case of humans are being formed. As a result of which they are said to be enucleated. While in these organisms also, the platelets, they have a distinct nucleus in the platelets. So that is the major difference between the blood cells in case of these organisms as well as the humans. Apart from that, function-wise, everything is the same. RBC is responsible for the transport of the gases, the transportation of gases. WBCs, they play a major role in defense mechanisms, while the platelets play an important role in the blood clotting mechanism or the coagulation process. Right? So this is what we have with the circulatory system in case of this organism, which is called as the frog. So three major components of the circulatory system in frog. One is the heart, the blood vessels, as well as the blood. Right? So heart, myogenic heart, the three-chambered heart, and this is how it looks. Right? So it is also referred to as the atriovenous heart, as well as the type of circulation here is said to be an incomplete double circulation. While the blood vessels, the arteries, veins, and capillaries, talking about the blood, they have plasma as well as the formed elements. In the formed elements, RBC, WBC, and platelets. Right. So with this, we have done with the next system, which is called the circulatory system. Right. So let's take up with another system now. The next system, what we have, actually, we have to take up with the excretory system. So what we'll do is excretory system will take up a little later, because the excretion and reproductive system both are said to be connected with each other. So together we'll take up the we'll take up the excretory system and the reproductive system as a common urinogenital system. Right. So we'll take up the excretory system at the end, and now we'll take up with the nervous system of this organism, and we'll see what are the components of the nervous system in these organisms. Now, talking about the nervous system here, the nervous system is again a very well developed nervous system here in these organisms, right? So the process of control and coordination in these organisms is brought about by two major systems, right? Two major systems. One is the nervous system, and the second one is the endocrine system. So these organisms also have an endocrine system also, which is involved in bringing about the process of control and coordination, right? So let's take up the nervous system. Right? So the control and coordination, as I've already mentioned, the process of control and coordination in these organisms is brought about by the nervous system as well as the endocrine system also. So nervous system, we know that it is the neurons which are responsible for the transportation or for the conduction of impulses or signals from one part of the body to the other part of the body. While in case of the endocrine system, we know that it is the chemical substances or the chemical signals called as the hormones which are being released into the blood, right, through which the signals are being passed on from one part of the body to the other part of the body. Now let us take up with the nervous system in these organisms. Now, the nervous system of these organisms consists of three major components. Right? There are three major components. Number one, the first one is called the CNS, which we know very well, which is called as the central nervous system. The second component of the nervous system here is called the peripheral nervous system, what we call it as PNS, the peripheral nervous system. And third component of the nervous system here is called as the ANS, which is simply called as the autonomic nervous system. Right? So these are the three major components of the nervous system in these organisms. They have the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, as well as the autonomic nervous system. Now, the central nervous system constitutes two important parts. One is the brain, and the other one is the spinal cord. So these are the two components of the central nervous system, the brain as well as the spinal cord. Right. So we know what is the brain, what is the role of brain, and what is the role of spinal cord. Major process of control and coordination is actually brought about by this brain and spinal cord. So they are actually considered as the controllers of the complete nervous system in our body, the brain as well as the spinal cord. Next, peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system also includes two major parts. One is the cranial nerves. And it includes basically nerves. So there are again two types of nerves, the cranial nerves and the other one is the spinal nerves. So they have the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So peripheral nervous system constitutes the nerves part of it. Cranial nerves are the ones which would arise from the brain. Spinal nerves are the ones which would arise from the spinal cord. Now these organisms have 10 pairs of cranial nerves. Right? So these are the organisms which have 10 pairs of cranial nerves. Now, talking about the autonomic nervous system or the ANS. Okay, ANS has two important parts or two important components. One is called the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system. And the second one would be the parasympathetic nervous system. Right? So two components of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, what does the sympathetic nervous system do? Sympathetic nervous system is the one which should actually prepare the body for extensive physical activities, right? So, sympathetic nervous system is the one which is responsible for preparing the body for extensive physical activities. That is the role of sympathetic nervous system. Now, what does parasympathetic nervous system do? Parasympathetic nervous system is the one which will start relaxing the body, bringing back all the components back to the normal conditions. So that is the role of parasympathetic nervous system, right? So sympathetic nervous system, it prepares the body for intense physical activities. After all of that is over, parasympathetic nervous system is the one which will start calming down the body, bringing back all the physiological processes back to normal is done by the parasympathetic nervous system. Right? So in these organisms also, that is frog, they have all of these three components, the CNS, the PNS, as well as the ANS. Right. Now, let's take up a few things with regards to the brain. Right. Now, talking about the brain here in these organisms is a well-developed structure. And it is said to be enclosed in a cavity, or it has been enclosed in a box, which is referred to as the cranium. Right. So that's the reason why all vertebrates, we will start calling them as craniates, because they have this hard structure which is called as cranium, which would start enclosing the entire brain inside it, protecting the brain from any sort of physical damage. Right. Now, we said that the brain is encapsulated in this box-like structure called as cranium. Now, after the cranium or towards the inner side of the cranium, the brain is again covered by two layers, what we actually call them as meninges. Right, so there are two meninges present in these organisms. In case of humans, we have three meninges, three layers. But in these organisms, there are two meninges which would actually cover the entire structure of the brain. And what are those meninges called as? The first one is called the dura mater, right, which would be the outer meningis, and the inner one would be called as the pia mater. Right, so there is this dura mater as well as the pia mater, which would cover the entire brain. Again, the major role of it is protection. Right, so two layers of protection. Apart after that, there is another hard layer of protection, which is called as the cranium. Now, the entire brain, in case of frogs, could be divided into three regions. Right, so the entire brain could be divided into three regions. The first region is called the forebrain. So we are actually not getting into the details of the functions, all that. So we are just talking about the anatomy. So I'll just give you the list of those names or different parts of the brain. So that alone will be doing. So first part of the brain is called the forebrain. The second one is the midbrain. And the third one is called the hindbrain. Okay, so three parts of the brain. So there is this forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Now talking about forebrain. The forebrain is again divided into three parts. So there are three regions of the forebrain. The first region of the forebrain is a paired structure, and it is usually referred to as an olfactory lobe. So there is olfactory lobe, and it is a paired structure, right? So there is one pair of olfactory lobes which are being present. Right. The second function is, or the second region is, they have something called as the cerebral hemispheres. So these cerebral hemispheres are also paired structures. There is one pair of cerebral hemisphere. It is completely a single one, but due to one partition that is present, it forms two hemispheres. That's the reason why we start calling it as a hemisphere. So it is basically called as the cerebrum. Cerebrum, because of that partition that is present in between the longitudinal fissure, we call it as, it would start dividing the entire cerebrum into two halves, and each half we would start calling it as a hemisphere. So there is a pair of cerebral hemispheres being present, and then there is one more structure which is called as the diencephalon. So this diencephalon is an unpaired structure, right? So two paired structures and one unpaired structure is a part of the forebrain, right? So the olfactory lobe and the cerebral hemisphere both are said to be paired structure, while the diencephalon is said to be an unpaired structure, right? So this is what we have in the forebrain part of it. The midbrain has only one part, and which is called as the optic lobes. So there is one pair of optic lobes being present in the midbrain, right? So one characteristic feature of optic lobes is we would start calling it as corpora bigemina. So the optic lobes in case of frog is usually referred to as corpora bigemina. Corpora bigemina. So in case of humans, we would start calling it as corpora quadrigemina, because the entire optic lobe is divided into four parts or four different regions. Right? Whereas here, the optic lobe is divided only into two regions, therefore we would start calling it as corpora bigemina. In case of humans, it is said to be corpora quadrigemina, four different lobes. So this is the midbrain, what is present. So the hindbrain again has two important parts, right? There are two parts of the hindbrain. One is called the cerebellum, right? The one is called the cerebellum, and the second one is called the medulla oblongata. Right, so these are the two parts of the hindbrain, cerebellum as well as the medulla oblongata. Now, this medulla oblongata is considered to be the posterior end of the brain, and this medulla oblongata is the one which would actually connect with that of the spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord are both said to be connected through a structure which is called as the foramen magnum. Right, the foramen magnum, and this foramen magnum is the one which would actually start connecting the spinal cord. It will start connecting the spinal cord, right? So medulla oblongata is the one which would open up into the spinal cord through this specialized structure which is called as the foramen magnum. So foramen magnum will start acting as a connection between the brain and the spinal cord. And which part of the brain? It is the medulla oblongata of the brain. Right? So this is what we have at the brain part of it. Talking about spinal cord again. So spinal cord again is a long tubular structure which runs throughout the backbone, right? And it is said to be encapsulated, just like how we said cranium covers the entire brain. The spinal cord is being covered by a structure called as the vertebral column. So we know we have the vertebral column, which we also call it as the backbone. So inside the backbone there is a cavity that is present, and inside the cavity the spinal cord actually runs from the neck region throughout the back part of it. Right? So this brain and spinal cord together, they are actually involved in bringing about the process of control and coordination, along with the help of the cranial nerves as well as the spinal nerves, which would arise from the brain as well as the spinal cord. Right? So as I already mentioned, the number of cranial nerves, they have 10 pairs of cranial nerves in these organs. Right? So this is what we have in the nervous system part of it. Now, along with this, these organisms also have some sort of sensory organs. There are 5 different sense organs present in these organs. Just like how we humans also have the sense organs. So these organisms also have 5 different types of sense organs. So let us quickly see what are those sense organs. The first sense organ what they have is the sense of touch. Right? So the first sense organs that they have, so talking about the sense organs. So the first sense organ what they have is the sense of touch. So for the sense of touch, they have some sensory receptors which are called as the sensory papillae. So this sensory pathway is responsible for bringing about the sense of touch. The second sensory organ what they have is the sense of smell. So for the sense of smell, they have something called as the nasal epithelium. So these nasal epithelial cells are responsible for the perception of the smell. The third sense organ is with regards to the taste, right? So for taste, they have something called as the taste buds. So they have these taste buds being present. And the next sense organ is with regards to the vision. So for vision, they are provided with large bulged eyes, right? And then the last sense organ is with regards to number 5, with regards to the hearing. Right. Now, with regards to the hearing, the sense organ what they have is nothing but the tympanum. So we know that these organisms do not have external ears, right? So the tympanum is the one which would actually represent the ears in these organs, right? Which is a part of the middle ear, right? So among all of these sensory structures that are present, the eyes and the tympanum, the senses for vision and hearing, they are said to be a highly developed structure compared to all of these. Whereas all the other three, they are said to be arranged in the form of the nerve aggregates, right? So whereas the vision sensory structures for vision and hearing, they are said to be a highly developed structure. So the type of eyes that are present here, they would have a simple eyes, right? And they have a bulged eyes, what we have already seen, which are located in something called as the orbits of the eye. So talking about the mechanism of hearing, the tympanum. So the tympanum is the one which would actually represents the external ear in these organs because the external ears are absent. So we have already seen that when we were talking about morphology, right? Behind the eye, I told you that there's a membranous structure which is being present, and that membranous structure is nothing but the tympanum. So tympanum opens up into the middle ear. Right? In the middle ear, it is nothing but an air-filled cavity, which consists of another structure which is called as the columella oris, right? Which would undergo the vibration or which would start generating the vibrations. So these vibrations will now be passed on into the inner ear, which is said to be a fluid-filled structure, right? And these vibrations, as they pass on through the inner ear, inside the inner ear, they have two sac-like structures which are present. We are all very much familiar with that, utriculus and sacculus, right? So through utriculus and sacculus, the process of hearing actually takes place. Now here, this ear in these organisms is responsible for hearing as well as the balancing organ, both as seen in case of humans also. In case of humans also, the function of ear is hearing as well as balancing. So even in these organisms also, the function of ear in these organisms is nothing but hearing as well as the balancing part of it. So these are the sensory structures that have been present. Now, the nervous system we have done. Second system, what we said, involved in the process of control and coordination is the endocrine system, right? So they also have this endocrine system. So we know that endocrine system is completely involved in the secretion of the chemical substances which are called as hormones. So these hormones are the ones which are responsible for the process of communication. They are the ones which would conduct the impulses or signals from one part of the body to the other part of the body. So we know that there are certain glands called as the endocrine glands which are being present. Now what do we mean by endocrine? Endocrine are nothing but the ductless glands. So those glands, what they do is they would start secreting certain chemical substances, and all of those chemical substances will be directly released into the blood. So once those chemical substances are released into the blood, so through the blood they would be transported to different parts of the body, and that's how they will start communicating with the other parts of the body. So some of the prominent endocrine glands that are present here in these organisms is they would have something called as the pituitary gland. We are all very much familiar with these glands because we have all studied about this in detail, right? So they have pituitary gland, right? Then they have thyroid gland, then they have something called as the parathyroid gland. They have this parathyroid gland being present, right? And along with that, so they have pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid gland. Then they also have adrenal gland, which is present right about the kidneys. Right, the adrenal in case of humans, the adrenal gland. Then they also have something called as the pineal gland, right? Pineal gland, right? Then a few of the glands. They also have something called as the gonads, right? So these are just a few of the glands to name, right? So the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the pineal gland, the gonads. They also have something called as the islets of Langerhans, which are a part of pancreas. So all of these glands, they start giving out their secretions in the form of hormones, and those hormones are released into the blood, and through the blood they are being transported to different parts of the body where they would start communicating with the other parts of the body. So the nervous system and the endocrine system together, they would start bringing about the process of coordination in these organs. So the process of control and coordination, as we have said, are well-developed structures because of the presence of both nervous system as well as the endocrine system, which would bring about the process of control and coordination in these organisms, right? So with this, we have done with another topic also, the process of control and coordination in these organisms, right? So in the next session, let us take up with the excretory system as well as the reproductive system in these organisms. So as I mentioned, a common system in case of males, we will start calling it as the urinogenital system. In case of female frogs, it is slightly different. So we'll take both of them in the next session, right?